Being stranded someplace with a no-start condition can definitely be a stressful situation, but it's important to not jump to conclusions and blame any part in the starting system before you correctly diagnose it, because there are many components that can cause this issue. So that's why in this video we're going over a basic diagnostic process so you can pinpoint the exact part that's causing your no-start condition. Vehicles can have two types of no-start conditions. One would be a crank no-start, where the starter is spinning the engine over, but it just can't keep going by itself and keep running. Now the other one is a no-crank no-start, and that's what we're experiencing here, is where the starter isn't even able to turn the engine over, so, well, it can't start and run. And that's the path we're gonna go down to fix our issue. If your car or truck is experiencing a no-start condition, you can jumpstart your repair at 1aauto.com. In order to not jump to conclusions, it's important to know all the conditions that are happening when you are experiencing a situation like this. For us, when I went inside to turn, or try to turn the engine on, I pressed the start button, and by the way, if you have a key, it's gonna be the same thing. The lights on the dash lit up nice and bright. The headlights on this particular vehicle, at least, they turn on with the ignition, and when they turned on, they were bright. And so that tells me the battery is not weak. It has plenty of voltage available. Now, it doesn't hurt to check, so with a multimeter on the battery, you want to see anywhere between 12.4 and 12.6 volts after it has sat for a while with the engine not running. I know ours is a little bit on the lower end, but that's because we've been cycling the ignition on and off, and likely that is what drained it. It's also equally important to check for corrosion at the battery terminals, because any corrosion between the post of the battery and the terminal itself can actually limit the amount of current flowing through, and therefore cause not just the starting system, but really any module that requires battery voltage in the system to not work properly. Knowing we have good voltage at the battery and nice clean connections, it's important to also check the fuses and the relays. In most vehicles, the starter fuse and relay is going to be in the engine junction box or the engine fuse box. In some cases, it'll be inside, but for the most part, you'll have to check your owner's manual to see the location of the fuse box and the location of the fuse/relay. Now, keep in mind that if you do find a fuse that is popped, it doesn't just pop by itself. Some sort of a short caused that issue. And if you hear noise coming from the starter, like a clicking or clunking, anything like what we're hearing here, well, in that case, it's getting power, it just can't do its job. Something that's actually easily overlooked is the ignition switch. So whether you have a push button start like this or a keyed ignition switch especially, it can actually interrupt the signal that's being sent to the starter so it can crank the engine over. When you have a keyed ignition switch that you turn, it might help, if you suspect that something could be wrong with it, it might help to wiggle it as you crank or turn the key to crank the engine over, because sometimes if there's a loose connection in there or it's not making contact, it's going to not start the engine. Same goes for the shifter and the neutral safety switch actually. Only in park and neutral will it allow the starter to spin, and sometimes if it gets worn out, wiggling the shifter a little bit could send that signal, and then you could pinpoint your problem. If wiggling the shifter or wiggling the key fixes the issue, well, you know where to look further. Checking for power at the starter is also important, and you can find it typically on the transmission side, although it does kind of go over the engine a little bit. And in most cases, if you have a front-wheel drive vehicle, it'll either be on the front of the engine by the radiator or on the back side. If you have a rear-wheel drive or four-wheel drive or all-wheel drive vehicles, you'll find it on either the passenger or the driver's side of the vehicle. Regardless, it's going to be underneath, and you're going to have two main connection points. A thicker wire that is held on with a mounting nut, sometimes covered with a boot, so you'll have to peel that back, and a smaller wire. The thicker wire is connected directly to your battery and feeds it all of the current that it needs to turn over, because this is pretty much the most powerful electrical component you have in the vehicle. The small wire is the signal or the trigger wire that it comes from the computer, but really it's commanded either when you press the button to start the vehicle or turn the key. That's how it gets fed some signal to then activate the solenoid and start the engine. Both of these have to have proper connection, so no corrosion, no chafed wires or broken wires, anything like that. Otherwise, the signal isn't going to make it here or even the full amperage and voltage that this starter needs. The other thing is the ground. So the ground is made through the mounting bolts of the starter, and that is how it is on pretty much every vehicle. That also has to be a good connection, not necessarily between the starter and the engine block, because usually that's not the problem, but the problem is between the engine block and the battery. There are ground cables or ground straps. Typically, if it's a main ground strap, it'll be somewhat out in the open and exposed, which is a downside because it can corrode. If it corrodes, it builds up resistance, or it could even break completely. And without that main ground strap, you might have enough current flow to run all the other smaller accessories, but nowhere near enough to power a powerful starter, which is in turn going to cause it not to work. So you want to check your ground straps and of course check for corrosion all around the starter. And when you test for power at the terminal on the starter, try grounding out your multimeter, if you're going to use that, to both the starter side and the engine side, and then of course if you can the battery, to see if there's any difference in voltage between all those points. We checked all of those connections and the ground straps. Everything checks out perfectly fine, so I can definitely say that the starter is going bad. Here's a little tip. If that is the case for you and your starter is just clicking, tap it with a hammer, have someone try to turn the key, and if you hold the key, tap it with a hammer, and the starter goes, yeah, that's a bad starter because it's not doing its job, and when you hit it, the shocks will basically vibrate it awake in a way, and it should start. But regardless, this is only a temporary fix. We need to replace the starter, and 1A Auto has us covered. Well, 1A Auto got us the starter we need, and this vehicle is back on the road again. Here's a quick tip to keep in mind as you're diagnosing this. If you have aftermarket accessories that are tapped into the factory harness, especially if you tap them into the starting system wiring, you want to pay attention to those because you could actually have a no crank or no start caused by either the wiring that is added on or even the connection point in the accessory that's tapped in without even having a bad part. It could just be an interruption in the wires that they're being tapped into. So you want to make sure that you check not just for a proper connection, but for corrosion right where it's tapped, and potentially even remove those accessories temporarily as you're diagnosing.